Now on the History Channel, stories from the pages of time. Stories of triumph and tragedy, adventure and achievement, as we go in search of history. Dinosaurs, giant creatures beyond our wildest imagination, weren't even heard of until the early 19th century, when many of their bones began to be discovered. Two of the world's greatest dinosaur hunters were controversial Americans, O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope. They started as friends and colleagues and ended as bitter enemies among the rich dinosaur hunting grounds of the American Badlands. Their competition was one of the most personal feuds in the history of science. The story of Marsh and Cope and more as we go in search of history for secrets of the dinosaur hunters.
Dinosaurs are nature's special effects. They're the only real dragons, the only real monsters we know. And to visit dinosaurs, you must go on a long, long voyage, not in distance, but in time.
Amazingly, there was a time when no one in the world knew dinosaurs existed. There were no skeletons or prehistoric beasts in museums. There was no word dinosaur. Suddenly, in the 1820s, isolated, ages-old bone scraps of colossal creatures were discovered in southern England. Based on such meager evidence, the first depictions of dinosaurs were straight out of the scientists' imaginations.
They were represented by science as being strange monsters, large, hideous creatures, more like something from mythology. They looked a lot like dragons and demons rather than creatures of nature.
Eventually, a stunned world came to know these hideous monsters as Megalosaurus, a meat-eating animal, and its plant-eating counterpart, Iguanodon. As anatomists such as England's Richard Owen studied the size and structure of fossil bone discoveries, a realization began to crystallize. These fantastic reptiles were a completely new, different type than living reptiles. A shocking notion at the time, as the concept of extinction didn't yet exist.
And so everyone believed that everything you see on Earth is everything that always was here and always would be. In other words, if it was created, that it would have been created one day and was always here.
So in 1842, Richard Owen made scientific history when he wrote,
"The combination of such characters, manifested by creatures far surpassing in size the largest of existing reptiles, will be deemed sufficient ground for establishing a distinct tribe of saurian reptiles, for which I would propose the name Dinosauria."
The discovery of a few strange teeth established the presence of dinosaurs in North America.
Dinosaurs had teeth like crocodiles or sharks. They would bite, tooth would break off. Doesn't matter, a new tooth would grow in. Those are the calling cards of dinosaur lifestyle.
The teeth were found in 1855 by a United States geologic expedition which had been surveying the Rocky Mountain Territory of Montana. Specimens from such expeditions were routinely sent to museums for identification. Scientists rarely, if ever, ventured into the field. And so the odd teeth wound up at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, America's premier scientific institution of the day, and in the hands of the country's leading paleontologist, Joseph Leidy.
He recognized the reptilian nature of the things, and he described 4 new species based on those teeth. They are what we would call Albertosaurus, Corythosaurus, a duck-billed dinosaur, Ankylosaur, the armored dinosaurs, and then a form called Troodon, which is a small meat-eating dinosaur.
Several years later, another more spectacular dinosaur find came to light in what was at the time the fossil hunting capital of America, New Jersey. 65 million years ago, at the end of the age of dinosaurs, the Cretaceous period, New Jersey was a coastal plain where ocean and land mingled to create shallow swamps and marshes. Below the surface lay green clay-like mineral deposits called marl. By the 19th century, farmers had discovered that marl, rich in nutrients, made the perfect fertilizer for growing crops. Companies which excavated marl flourished in southern and central New Jersey.
These rich green clays that they were digging up sometimes coughed up fossil remains of creatures that used to live in the ocean. But occasionally, they would find some dinosaur bones there.
In 1858, marl workers uncovered big bones from an unknown animal. At the time, the 49 bones and teeth that were sent to Joseph Leidy represented the most complete dinosaur skeleton in the world. Leidy named the duck-billed creature Hadrosaurus, or bulky lizard.
What Joseph Leidy was able to determine, first of all, was that this dinosaur walked on its hind legs. That's because the front legs were shorter than its back legs. He could also tell it was a vegetarian. This we know because the small part of the jaw that he found had what we would think of as plant-eating teeth in it.
In the 1860s, Joseph Leidy was at the center of dinosaur research in the United States. But soon, Leidy's focus would shift to other natural sciences, and he would be out of the dinosaur business. He was undercut by two younger and independently wealthy men who, unlike Leidy, could encourage and attract fossil hunters by paying good money for their finds. One was Othniel Charles Marsh, the other, Leidy's own protege, Edward Drinker Cope. Edward Drinker Cope, born to a wealthy Quaker family, had developed an early interest in fossils.
As a child, he would go to the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, the museum, where he would make sketches, these marvelous sketches of the specimens on display. I think he was probably also kind of a nuisance to the scientists there, bringing in things for them to look at and probably asking questions that they didn't have the answers to.
In 1861, the 21-year-old Cope began working tirelessly at the Academy of Natural Sciences under Joseph Leidy's tutelage. As Cope toiled at cataloging the Academy's fossil collection, he dreamed of making a name for himself. 5 years earlier, O.C. Marsh was attending Yale College when he began to think about turning a boyhood fascination with fossils into a career.
He wanted to really be in control of a career in that field. He wanted to be well known, and he wanted to build something lasting that he could put his name on.
By 1865, 34-year-old Marsh had convinced his wealthy uncle George Peabody, a Massachusetts businessman and philanthropist, to spend $150,000 to fund the construction of a Yale museum. It would be called the Peabody Museum of Natural History, and Marsh would serve as the institution's paleontologist. He planned to fill the museum with huge collections of what had become his single-minded passion, vertebrate fossil bones. When we return to In Search of History, these ambitious young scientists, Marsh and Cope, prepare for a level of renown that the field of paleontology had never before witnessed. The word dinosaur comes from the Greek language and means terrible lizard. In Search of History will return. In Search of History returns to Secrets of the Dinosaur Hunters. O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope first met in Germany in 1863. Each had gone abroad to increase his knowledge of the natural sciences.
Both were going to different museums in Europe, absorbing everything they could, meeting scientists, really learning natural history in a hands-on way. And these were the days when you couldn't just go to college and get a degree in paleontology.
Back in the United States, a correspondence began between Cope in Philadelphia and Marsh in New Haven. The two regularly exchanged opinions about specimens.
It was clear that Cope really admired Marsh. And Marsh had something that Cope didn't. He had his own museum. There was every indication at this point in their lives that these two men would not only become good friends, but would probably be great collaborators in the field of dinosaur science.
At first, Cope's star appeared to shine more brightly than Marsh's. He had made a point of making himself known to the nearby New Jersey marl workers, so for a small fee, they would provide him with fossil finds. In 1866, Cope received some spectacular bones unearthed by the workers. They represented at that time the most complete skeleton of a meat-eating dinosaur. The discovery put Cope in the dinosaur business. He wrote to his father,
"I found the remains of much greater interest than I anticipated, being nothing more or less than a totally new gigantic carnivorous dinosaurian, which was the devourer and destroyer of Leidy's Hadrosaurus, and of all else it could lay claws on."
And so Cope thought this was a terrific animal, and he published on it, called it Laelaps aquilunguis. And Laelaps is a leaping animal. It's a very poetic name that he chose. Unfortunately, Professor Marsh pointed out that it was a name that had already been used previously, I think, to name a spider. So Marsh proposed the name Dryptosaurus aquilunguis, and that's the name that it is referred to today.
It would not be the last time Marsh would question Cope's scientific skills. In 1868, Cope received an amazing find from Kansas. Fossils of a 40-foot-long marine reptile dating from the age of dinosaurs. Cope rushed to publication on the specimen, naming it Elasmosaurus. He proudly showed the creature to his friend O.C. Marsh, who was visiting Philadelphia from New Haven.
And Marsh, in probably his own special way, announced to Cope and to Leidy that Cope had made a serious error with regard to his mounting of that particular marine reptile, that he had taken the skull and put it on the tail.
But it was clearly very embarrassing for Cope, and he tried to pull back all of the issues of that publication, and he got most of them back apparently, but not all of them. He did his reconstruction with the head on the other end, and it was only later that apparently among the people that he tried to blame for his mistake was Leidy.
The incident illustrates some basic character traits of each man. Cope was brash with an active imagination that often encouraged inaccurate speculation. A self-promoter, Cope would defend his reputation to the end.
Marsh, on the other hand, was more of a methodical thinker, an organizer, a planner, a behind-the-scenes kind of guy, a classic politician, if you will. He was thought of as a schemer who always had something in mind for his own gain. But actually, both of these men were like that. They both wanted to win.
The initial battle site, the New Jersey marl pits. In 1868, Marsh spent a week with Cope tramping around the New Jersey countryside, tracking down promising fossil sites. At the marl companies, Cope introduced Marsh to key workers who supplied Cope with his precious fossils. But 1 year later, Cope learned the true purpose of Marsh's visit when his so-called friend began to publish scientific articles containing descriptions of marl fossils.
There was one article. It was about a Mosasaurus, which is a kind of marine reptile, not a dinosaur, but it lived at the same time. And Marsh decided to name it after his good friend Cope from Philadelphia. So he named it Mosasaurus copeanus. And I'm sure Cope wasn't too amused when he saw that.
Cope was even less amused when he realized Marsh had surreptitiously paid off the Marl Company workers, so specimens that normally would have gone to Cope at the Academy wound up at Yale in the hands of Marsh. For a while, Cope fumed silently, but the stage was set for a clash of wills the likes of which science had rarely seen. The feud had begun. Each man's independent wealth, and thus his ability to fund any field project, fostered what would become an intense, nasty competition to find and name the most fossils.
Amateurs who were finding fossils and people at these Marl companies, they now had a couple of people to play off against each other in case they wanted to get some more money for the fossils they were finding.
In 1870, Marsh upped the ante. He funded and set out on what would become the first ever of 4 field expeditions with the sole purpose of searching for fossils. Instead of leaving their discovery to the random luck of surveying parties or Marl workers, Marsh and his team would actually do their own digging. Marsh's destination? The Badlands of the American West.
Marsh knew that Leidy's original dinosaur specimens had come from the West, so there was every indication that there were more fossils to be found out there.
When we return to In Search of History, what was waiting to be found out there would stun not only Marsh and Cope, but the entire world. Some scientists believe dinosaurs may not be technically extinct. They say the skeletal structure of birds shows them to be the descendants of dinosaurs. In Search of History will return. In Search of History returns to Secrets of the Dinosaur Hunters. O.C. Marsh's expeditions to the American West made him famous. Although fossil beds brimming with dinosaur skeletons would remain hidden for several years, Marsh's trips in the early 1870s yielded tons of mammal fossils that created the foundation for his collection at the Peabody Museum. In 1871, Cope, jealous of Marsh's success, mounted his own expeditions to the West. 1 year later, the former friends were taking potshots at each other in scientific journals. Marsh disputed one of Cope's claims by writing,
"Surely, such an animal belongs in the Arabian Nights and not in the records of modern science."
Cope defended himself by calling Marsh's criticisms
misrepresentations that are either criminally ambiguous or untrue.
By 1873, Cope and Marsh had become bitter enemies. They were enmeshed in a continual battle to claim the most fossil discoveries and name the most specimens. While the wild western landscape of the 1870s could at times be beautiful, the dinosaur hunters usually toiled year-round under extremely difficult conditions, some of which are depicted in the watercolors of one worker.
They were making less than 25 cents a day. So it wasn't a lot of money even back then, but still, there they were, out loyally, out digging.
Rifles and pistols offered the dinosaur hunters protection against warring Native Americans, such as Sitting Bull Sioux and his allies.
The Indian Wars were still being fought out there. The Custer Massacre was happening during that time. And it often put the paleontologists in difficult situations. It was a very difficult time, I'm sure, to travel in the American West.
Working in Montana Territory, Cope had found a way to ease the tension with more friendly Native Americans, such as the Crow.
The Crow came to visit them one night to see what they were up to, and Cope just happened to take out his false teeth. This was a shock to them, but they were very amused. They brought their friends back night after night, and Cope would take his teeth out to entertain them.
The competition between Cope and Marsh heated up in 1877 when a Colorado schoolteacher, Arthur Lakes, unwittingly set off the Great Dinosaur Bone Rush.
Cope and Marsh had been frequent visitors to the West for about 4 years. They had brought expeditions and many men. They had befriended many of the locals and had hired people to be fossil collectors for them. So by this time, people in these areas of the West were aware that Cope and Marsh were willing to pay good money for fossils. By 1877, the scene was set for all hell to break loose if the right kind of major fossil discovery was made, and it was.
Near Denver in Morrison, Colorado, Arthur Lakes had found some enormous bones from a 60 to 70-foot creature. He played Marsh and Cope against each other by notifying both men. Marsh was the first to respond, buying the bones with a $100 check. Marsh had hit fossil pay dirt. The remains of a long-necked, plant-eating dinosaur emerged from the Colorado site. Nothing so gigantic had ever been found. Marsh named the creature Apatosaurus, the deceptive lizard, because he thought the tailbone looked more like that of a lizard than a dinosaur. In the summer of 1877 at Canyon City, Colorado, about 100 miles south of Marsh's site, a fossil bed with huge bones was found by a Colorado fossil hunter. Cope received the news first. As a result, he soon announced the discovery of Camarasaurus, another plant eater. Cope had turned the tables on Marsh. He wrote,
"The specimen exceeds in proportions any other land animal hitherto described, including the one found by Professor Arthur Lakes."
Massive leg bones, colossal backbones. Cope and Marsh had happened upon a previously unknown era of dinosaurs. They were unearthing the land of the herbivorous giants, dating back 150 million years to the late Jurassic period. But what was to come would prove even more amazing. From the Badlands of Wyoming, Marsh received a letter that summer in 1877 from 2 railroad workers who had discovered fantastic bones near Laramie.
"We are working men and are not able to present them as a gift. And if we can sell the secret of the fossil bed and procure work in excavating others, we would like to do so."
What the men had discovered was a bone bed that, as one of Marsh's workers wrote, extended for several miles.
"The bones are very thick, well preserved, and easy to get out. I will send a ton a week gotten out good."
This bone bed came to be known as Como Bluff. It's still one of the best dinosaur quarries in the world.
Most people who see it for the first time, Como Bluff, have a sense about it, like the place radiates this deep Jurassic tone. It's full of bones. You can't walk for more than 10 minutes without seeing a new dinosaur weathering out.
What was the secret to this so-called Jurassic Park, this treasure trove of dinosaur remains?
Probably the mud. The rivers would overflow their banks, and 10 feet of sand and mud would come swooshing over you, and you would be buried in 30 seconds. Buried in 10 feet of encasing mud, which would harden to rock. Now you're preserved. Now your head's preserved, your tail, your feet, everything.
Marsh paid the railroad men $75 for their initial discovery, and his team went to work. But a fossil site as rich as Como Bluff was bound to attract dinosaur hunters in Cope's employ, and it did. The 2 teams were on constant alert, as if they were at war.
And there seemed to be a fair amount of animosity throughout anybody associated with the fossil collecting out there. You were either in Cope's camp or you were in Marsh's camp.
The field collectors never came to blows, but there were instances of unscientific behavior.
There is evidence that Marsh's men, when they were abandoning a fossil site that had not been completely finished, were instructed to destroy fossils that were left in the ground rather than let Cope's men recover them later.
Marsh's Como Bluff team proved much more successful than Cope's. Over 6.5 years, the Marsh crew would ship 500 crates of dinosaur bones to the Peabody Museum at Yale, and they were spectacular. Instead of the fragmented fossils coughed up by the New Jersey marl beds, Como Bluff yielded nearly complete skeletons.
So what had become sort of a vague impression, an incomplete impression, suddenly became fleshed out. Now you could look at a dinosaur nose to tail, shoulders to toes.
And that's what truly ignited dinosaur science in so many ways. They were finding extraordinary clues about life in the past. It really fired their imaginations. They could begin to think of dinosaurs as living creatures and understand what that world was really like.
From this Jurassic graveyard, Marsh ended up naming more than 24 new dinosaurs, including some of the most famous ones. The herbivores Brontosaurus, now known as Apatosaurus, Diplodocus, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, and one of the most spectacular meat-eaters ever, Allosaurus. Cope, however, wasn't ready to give up. When we return to In Search of History, who would ultimately win the great dinosaur wars? In 1877, during the start of the dinosaur bone rush, in New York, the Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show is inaugurated with 1,201 entries. In Moscow, Tchaikovsky debuts his ballet Swan Lake. And in England, the first Wimbledon Lawn Tennis Championship matches are organized. In Search of History will return. In Search of History returns to Secrets of the Dinosaur Hunters. By the late 1880s, Edward Drinker Cope's wealth was all but depleted after spending the modern-day equivalent of millions of dollars to finance his own expeditions and research. Desperate, Cope found work as a paleontologist on one of the 4 U.S. geologic surveys charting the Great Western Frontier.
People like Cope and Marsh were often funded by the government to go out on these expeditions and identify the age of the Earth based on the fossils that they were finding there. As part of the deal, so to speak, Cope and Marsh were able to collect these fossils and bring them back, and they would become part of their own collections.
It was at this point that Marsh changed the direction of his rival's life. In the name of efficiency, Marsh, as acting president of the National Academy of Sciences, persuaded the United States Congress to combine the number of survey teams to 1, and to name him, Marsh, chief vertebrate paleontologist in charge of the remaining survey and its finances.
As soon as Marsh did that, Cope knew exactly what was going to happen. He would not see a red cent from the government anymore as long as Marsh was in that position. And that's exactly what happened.
Cope's days as a dinosaur hunter were over. He turned to popularizing dinosaurs via public lectures and to writing what would become commonly known as Cope's Bible, a lengthy work detailing his fossil finds. it continues to be prized by modern-day paleontologists. By 1889, the only thing Cope owned of value was his tremendous collection of fossils. And again, because of Marsh's interference, he was in danger of losing it. The federal government demanded that Cope turn over his fossils, since some finds had been gathered while he was working for a government survey. Cope knew Marsh was behind this.
This was the last straw for Cope. He decided to do something that was unheard of at the time, and that was to go directly to the newspapers and see if he could cause enough trouble for Marsh to get him off his back once and for all.
Beginning on January 12, 1890, the bitter feud between Cope and Marsh moved to the front pages of the New York Herald. Not only did Cope plead the case for keeping his bones, but he attacked Marsh's character. Marsh, in turn, painted his rival as a bad scientist. His evidence? The infamous Elasmosaurus incident. Marsh wrote in the Herald that he had tried to point out Cope's mistake, but
Professor Cope's indignation was great, and he asserted in strong language that he had studied the animal for many months and ought to know one end from the other.
Marsh, now he came across as the calm and collected one. Cope, on the other hand, came across as being rather petty and frivolous, as a careless scientist, and really as a desperate man who would go to great lengths to hurt his rival.
in spite of this, Cope was victorious. He kept his precious fossils, and he helped damage Marsh politically. The newspaper furor called attention to the U.S. Geologic Survey, and as a consequence, many in Congress came to believe the project had squandered funds on frivolous research. In 1892, Congress shut down the survey, and Marsh was forced to resign his position as chief vertebrate paleontologist at about the same time his inheritance from Uncle George Peabody was drying up. He had to divide his own fossil collection and return the specimens he had collected at government expense. Marsh's collection, including hundreds of dinosaur fossils, filled 2 museums, including his own Peabody Museum. He spent his remaining years at the Peabody preparing and maintaining his collection for display. In 1895, Cope, with money problems still haunting him, sold for $32,000 most of his fossil collection, 10,000 specimens, to the American Museum of Natural History in New York.
Their rivalry drove them both nearly into financial ruin, and so they don't even really have, the legacy of one complete collection that's still in place at the institutions which they represented at the time.
Cope died at 57 years of age in 1897. Marsh at age 67, less than 2 years later. The rivalry between Marsh and Cope has had long-lasting consequences, both positive and negative, on the world of paleontology.
One can hardly imagine how much we would know today if these two men had collaborated more. However, we could also argue that it was their competition that spurred them on, that made them discover more.
But in their race to win fame, mistakes were made.
Between the two of them, they named 149 new species of dinosaurs. But they did a lot of that in great haste. Today, only 37 of those 149 are still recognized as being valid.
Marsh named the most species, 31, but he is also famous for a tremendous fossil blooper involving Brontosaurus. When Marsh's men discovered the plant-munching behemoth at Como Bluff in 1879, it was the most complete skeleton of a long-necked giant yet found, but it was missing a head, for which Marsh began to search.
He went to a different quarry, still Como Bluff, an earlier quarry, and he found this head, big, boxy head. Now he knew darn well that where this head was found, there were no Brontosaurus bones. But, well, he didn't tell anybody. That's the same kind of head everyone copied. Other people put up Brontosaurus skeletons. New York did, Smithsonian, Carnegie. Everyone who dealt with these animals had a Brontosaurus with that type of head. It's the wrong head. It's the wrong head.
It wasn't until 100 years later that Marsh's mistake was discovered and corrected, along with his naming the same creature 2 separate times. First Apatosaurus, then Brontosaurus.
Considering the fact that nobody knew anything about dinosaurs, they got so much right.
It was Marsh who figured out that the plates on Stegosaurus stand upright. Cope grasped the correct stance of a sauropod with the legs underneath the body. So, in their race to find the most dinosaur bones, did Marsh beat Cope or vice versa? Actually, the passage of time has downplayed the hatred that separated these 2 great scientists and has pushed them together.
When all is said and done, it is impossible to think of Cope without Marsh, and Marsh without Cope anymore. These 2 men now stand shoulder to shoulder in the history of dinosaur science, something of which I'm sure they would both greatly disapprove.
When In Search of History continues, the competition to find dinosaur bones outlasts Cope and Marsh. In his will, Cope asked that his brain be preserved. It's rumored that he wanted it compared in size to Marsh's brain to determine once and for all which of them was truly superior. In Search of History will return. In Search of History returns to Secrets of the Dinosaur Hunters. History's first serious dinosaur hunters, O.C. Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, started a public dinosaur craze that continues to this day. From hugely popular movies to well-attended dinosaur exhibits, these creatures continue to capture our imaginations.
You will share the unending thrills and excitement of a world of primitive wonders.
Such interest has, in turn, placed a high premium on quality dinosaur fossils. For museums, big dinosaurs often mean big attendance. So prime dinosaur fossils have taken on the cachet of fine art and are commanding high prices. During their lives, Marsh and Cope were each other's only competition for the best bones. But today, the marketplace for superior dinosaur bones is much larger, with numerous museums and private collections clamoring for the most important specimens. In the fall of 1997, a Tyrannosaurus rex was auctioned at Sotheby's in New York. Named Sue, this fossil has been described as perhaps the best T-Rex ever unearthed.
Let us, if we're all ready, begin the competition for Sue the Tyrannosaurus Rex. And I begin with a bid of $500,000. Now bidding at $500,000. I'm bidding at $3 million. In 2 places, $5 million, $7 million. Is there any advance over 7.4? Fair warning then at $7,600,000.
After a heated 9 minutes of bidding, Sue was sold for nearly $8.4 million. Backed by the financing of corporate sponsors, Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History won the bidding war to become Sue's new home. With Sue, an extremely high benchmark has been set on the value of exceptional dinosaur fossils, a fact that some paleontologists find disturbing.
As unpleasant as it may sound, I think the sale of Sue is going to be a pivotal Lynch occurrence in terms of changing the face of vertebrate paleontology in North America. It was in no way thought of at the time of the sale of the types of secondary problems that we're encountering now would ever occur. But we're seeing now, for example, in Montana, theft. We've seen attempted black market sale, and some of the most egregious events have occurred after the sale of Sioux.
Dinosaur hunter Keith Rigby has been the victim of alleged unscrupulous collectors. In the summer of 1997, Rigby and his team of volunteers were on an annual fossil hunting expedition in northeast Montana when an extraordinary find turned up. A T-Rex specimen that may be the largest meat eater ever found. It was dubbed Pex Rex after the nearby Fort Peck Lake.
We suspect, based on some really scrappy evidence, that this may be a very, very large T-Rex. We suspect it's not alone. We suspect there may be more than one. Perhaps two, maybe even fragments of a third. But it is in the company of a host of other things, other dinosaurs that lived in the last gasp of dinosaur reign in North America.
The excitement of the find was soon tempered by the encroaching winter.
It always happens. Just the few days before you pack up and go home, you find your best thing. So what we did is we essentially prepped it for a long-term stay over the winter.
Soon, questionable land ownership claims surfaced, which turned a celebration of discovery into a race to preserve the specimen. A local Montana family with whom Rigby had been working claimed it owned the land where Pex Rex was found. But the rightful owner turned out to be the federal government. So Rigby set out to obtain approvals. Suddenly, trouble.
We were notified by some local residents in Montana that the site had been vandalized, that they were in the process of vandalizing it, and that the very individuals that we had trusted the most in terms of its care and safekeeping, namely the landowners who had alleged that it was their land, were in fact the perpetrators.
In a conflict reminiscent of the one between Marsh and Cope, the professed landowners were trying to dig up the T-Rex and sell it on the open market. Rigby and his crew immediately rushed back to the site, but not before the damage had been done.
Some parts of the skull had actually been broken off and removed. Those materials were then later reacquired by the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Montana, and those remain yet in their custody pending criminal proceedings.
Dinosaurs still are information. They represent information, and if they're ripped out of the ground like the one in northern Montana, they become useless. I mean, that's just useless data.
With a total catastrophe averted, Rigby's crew went through the painstaking process of removing the rest of the fossil.
You got yours ready for plastering?
To the great satisfaction of the local people who had rallied around Rigby, the government ordered that Pex Rex be put on permanent display in a Montana museum.
We talk about the Cope and Marsh Wars. We talk about the long history of research in dinosaurs in the western United States. This is part of the western states' lore and culture. As much a part of it as buffalo hunts or transcontinental railroad or rodeo or any number of other things. This belongs as part and parcel to what the West is about.
During their lifetimes, Marsh and Cope each compiled an incredible record. Contemporary dinosaur hunters are continuing that tradition, revealing the Earth's fantastic secrets in their own quests in search of history.